All right, so it was a toss-up. Do I preach about that wonderful gospel? But I have to tell you, 1 Samuel got my heart and got my attention. You know, kings and crowns and majesties and all of that. We're all, no offense, but, we Americans tend to, be interested in that stuff, don't we? Well, let me share with you some famous or infamous quotes about kings in honor of our great Hebrew Bible story from 1 Samuel. Thomas Edison wrote, "I have friends in overalls whose friendship I would not swap for the favor of the kings of the world." Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, he wrote, "Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer that question." And finally, a quote from Khalil Gibran, "Yesterday we obeyed kings and bent our necks before emperors. But today we kneel only to trust. We follow only beauty and obey only love." Almost sounds like something Michael Curry would have written. Well, in our Hebrew Bible reading this morning, we have the Hebrews again causing a ruckus. They're again questioning Yahweh's rule over them through judges and prophets. They tell Samuel, that last great prophet, that they want a king to rule over them versus Samuel's sons, who have shown their less than honorable ways. Well, now we parents know a thing about raising our children. Sometimes our children want to do their own thing, and they go against our wishes or our beliefs. And that seems to have been the case with Samuel and his sons. Ironically, ruling judges like Samuel did not pass on their roles to their children. And prior to that ancient writing, judges and prophets were appointed by God. So maybe the great Samuel was making a grave mistake with his son's appointment. It seems that he was overlooking their sins and misgivings while judging others. So the people decided to take matters into their own hands, kind of like a legal referendum or even a coup. And they demanded that they have a king to rule over them, like the other countries around them. The leaders came together and addressed this issue with Samuel. And that was a wise move to question Samuel's choice, but not exactly too wise to demand a king to rule over them, at least in that particular point in history. You see, several centuries earlier, actually in Deuteronomy, if you want to look that up in chapter 17, God does have a plan for a king for Israel. But for the leaders to demand one now and wanting to be like all the other nations basically was not a good reason at all. Have we not heard our own children tell us sometimes that they want to do something or have something because everybody else has it, mom or dad, right? So we try our best to explain why those are not good reasons, even in this 21st century. God had appointed judges over the people, usually to meet a specific need or in a time of a particular crisis. Judges did not make government. But a king would not be doing this. A king rules as long as he lives, and then passes his kingdom on to his descendants. Now, as a side note, in Judges 8, Gideon was offered the kingdom, the throne of Israel, but he refused it to the people and said, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." And Israel went on for about 400 and some odd years after that in the promised land without a king. The only king that they acknowledged was Yahweh. Now Samuel goes and he prays to the Lord. Good Samuel. And God tells him to fulfill the leader's request. I'm sure that surprised him. But that's what God told him to do. Not because the people's request was right or good, but because God would use this to teach his people a lesson. Sounds like smart parenting. Well, God always wanted Israel to put their trust in him, not in a king. But here, God is also telling Samuel not to take this all too personally. You know, the people were rejecting God's rule, not Samuel. And when I was writing this, what came to mind was when Jesus stood before Pilate, and the mob said, "We have no king but Caesar." And those were prophetic words rejecting Jesus as their king. Now God does one thing further. Samuel has to warn the nation about kings. Not all kings are good or just, not even English kings. Having a king rule would not necessarily solve the people's problems. Rather, it could create more. And Samuel tells them, he will take, as David wrote from that first reading this morning. And you will be his servants. You know, remember, they have chosen to have a king at this time. If Israel had waited for God's king, because he promised them one way back in Deuteronomy, they would not be crying out like this. But again, at that time, at that moment, they insisted and demanded that they have a king. So God gave Israel a king, and Saul was the first king of Israel. And Saul's name means asked. So people asked, and God permitted them to get. Saul and his army fought many skirmishes for the Hebrews, and finally they come up against the Philistines. And now in battle, all of Saul's sons were killed. And as a result, Saul eventually commits suicide. But God does provide a king for his people, because God's time provided the king of David, who fought against the Philistines and won. Now remember, the people had demanded a king. God allowed Saul to be the first king of Israel, but it was not God's choice, that was the people's choice. And it's almost humorous, how the people rejected the rule of God through the prophets and judges, but they could not escape God's rule and God's plan for a king in his own time, David. So the bottom line of all this wonderful biblical history story, do not resist the rule of God. When we resist God, we really only hurt ourselves. Nelson Mandela has a quote, and he said, "I am a king. I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." I love Nelson Mandela. Well, God had a plan for Israel in his own time. And God also has a plan for each and every one of us. But in his own time. So perhaps we need to learn to cooperate with God's plan. And let us know in our hearts and our heads that God is truly in charge. Thank heavens. Amen.
Amen.